This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman
and Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod.
So welcome back to Art of Darkness. This is a very special Dark Room episode where, for folks who listen to us know, we dig back into a subject we've already covered with a special guest who, knows more than we do.
It's not hard. It's a very low bar. We're going to have so many guests come on. It's limitless. Yeah.
Yeah. So today we're having on. We're gonna go back into William Faulkner, and to help us out with that, we have the great Carl Rollyson, a professional biographer with the University of Toronto PhD. He's written acclaimed biographies on Marilyn Monroe, Susan Sontag, Sylvia Plath, Amy Lowell, Rebecca West, and of course William Faulkner. 2 volumes of William Faulkner biography. Not only is Mr. Rollyson a preeminent biographer, but he's also a leading voice on the topic of biography in itself, as a craft or as an art form, with books like Biography, A User's Guide, which I'm going to read, and his podcast, A Life in Biography, where not only does he talk about the craft of biography, gives some biographical profiles, and also interviews other great biographers. He's written columns for the New York Sun, book reviews for many of the big papers, including Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and many, many others. He's also got a couple biographical plays out there about on Rebecca West and Walter Brennan. Kevin's a playwright, so that's going to perk his ears up quite a bit.
One of us.
And as I was doing a little bit of research, I found this great quote from Anne Waldron, the biographer of Eudora Welty and Carolyn Gordon. She says, Carl Rollyson knows more about biographies than anyone else in the world. His independent mind, his experience, and his voracious reading have equipped him to produce amazing insights into the reading and writing of biographies. So, Carl, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for giving us your time. We really appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome.
Yeah,
I hope I can live up to that introduction.
Oh, yeah, I guess we'll see. But it's there's a number of things that made you a man after my own heart. So your interest in William Faulkner, and also the fact that you've got so many irons and so many fires, as Kevin and I both tend to do as well. So yeah, it's really excited to talk to you. I think I was drawn to you initially in my Twittering for the Art of Darkness Twitter account. That's at Art of Dark Pod. You're doing a day by day in the life of William Faulkner. Where are you drawing that material from? How do you get that?
It's a collection of all sorts of things. Some obvious places to look in his selected letters that Joseph Blattner published.
Okay.
So you have a lot of dates there. And events and people to draw on. So that's one. All the other biographies of Faulkner, including mine, I'm doing for the day by day. And probably most important is the fact that since I've written a biography of Faulkner, I've done a lot of archival work at the University of Virginia, University of South Carolina, many other archives that hold his work. And a lot of that material gets into biographies, of course.
Right.
But the point about a day-by-day book is it's not a narrative. It is a kind of diary. And there are all sorts of things that, even in a 2-volume biography, you have to leave out.
Right.
And because there are certain details that fit your narrative, and certain details which might be interesting in and of themselves, but would make the book just impossibly long.
Right.
So I decided this would be a good way to do, in a sense, a biography without a narrative, and and what you can do in that case is, in a sense, if you're the reader of Day by Day, is you could sort of create your own biography of Faulkner. Look at the kinds of details that biographers do pick out and make a story out of. So I've been very interested in that. I did this for Marilyn Monroe. I have a Marilyn Monroe Day by Day book, and I'm working on a 2-volume biography of Sylvia Plath. The Faulkner Day by Days. Yeah, it's one.
You're doing the Day by Day for her as well, right? Or
yes, I am.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I thought it was going to be 1 volume, but more than any other biographical subject I've worked on, she made a point of recording her life in diaries. She started keeping diaries at the age of 12. So even though she only lived, to the age of 30, the amount of material in journals, diaries, letters, manuscripts is quite phenomenal. Plus, in the 40s, she was a great listener to radio programs.
Okay.
So I have a lot of annotations. She would listen to programs like Charlie McCarthy and The Great Gildersleeve and Jack Benny. And a lot of these old-time radio shows are now online. So I have links to them. So you could actually read her Day by Day and go right to that program if you want.
That's really
I love that.
Yeah, that's really
brilliant.
Neat.
Well, that might be a good segue into the thing we're teasing for the After Dark episode for our Patreon subscribers, which has to do with Faulkner's favorite television show. But we'll let that sit. We'll let that sit for now, and that's of course at patreon.com/artofdarkpod.
Yeah. So this kind of leads me to the Faulkner and Sylvia Plath. These are 2 figures that are interesting to me. One day we will do a Sylvia Plath episode, and we will rely on your biographies with plenty of credit to create as what we have been instructed. We're doing profiles. And I think that's accurate.
I have to update the website now.
Yeah,
I'm actually kind of upset. I got homework after this episode. This is like Jimi Hendrix meeting the guy who builds Fender guitars or whatever Hendrix.
Yeah,
do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
So this is a really exciting episode. A lot of fun.
Yeah. So and I'm glad you kind of mentioned the archival material. I think one thing that can get lost in the sort of the age of the internet and everything being so readily available online, and not that we're digging into archives so much, it's really not the thrust of our show, but both Kevin and I have spent Kevin and I went to University of Texas for graduate school, and we spent a lot of time at the Harry Ransom Center down there.
Oh yeah,
huge, which is an incredible archive. And they had a limited amount of Faulkner's. I think it was some of his personal letters and his photographs.
They have something else really important.
What's that?
There was a biographer, Carl Rollyson, who started to research a biography of Faulkner in 1948. And until his death in the early 1990s, kept promising this biography, and it never appeared. And a lot of people, including me, were skeptical that he had he'd made his whole career.
He was going to write this book.
Deliver a biography. He never did. So I went to the Ransom Center, and there were 105 boxes of material that he collected. And I'm the first biographer to go through every single box, every piece of paper. And what I found was an extraordinary treasure. For instance, Faulkner, when he came to New York, loved to stay at the Algonquin. So one of the things that Carl Rollyson did was interview the staff of the Algonquin about Faulkner. What he was like.
That'll get you the dirt, right? Talking to those kinds of people.
The hotel.
Just, a sense of him as a person. And Collins was an academic. He was a professor at Notre Dame. And that was not the sort of thing that most, even biographers who were academics, it was not the kind of thing, they were interested in the work, and they didn't get into that kind of usually the nitty gritty. It's more likely today for that to happen, but as a result, all the stuff that Collins accumulated, he became best friends with one of Faulkner's lovers, for example. I mean, the incredible amount of detail just improved the texture of my biography immeasurably. And I was just astonished that, there have been several Faulkner biographies that no biographer had really taken the time to do that.
Yeah, that's what's amazing about this archival material, and I want to talk more about specifically your 2 volumes, but just kind of nerding out about the wonders of archives for a minute. That's what's kind of so great about them. There can be these things just sitting in a shelf somewhere. They're being taken care of. They're kept, safe from degradation, and yet nobody goes to see them because I guess there's 1 or 2 steps of hoops you have to jump through before you get to them. You can't just click on a link, and so nobody goes to look at them. And I know I've had profound experiences going through some of the. I didn't get into that part of the Faulkner archive, but looking at there was some Hemingway stuff at the Harry Ransom Center. There's and some more modern writers. The Don DeLillo archive is there. Some David Foster Wallace stuff.
Norman Mailer has a huge archive.
Norman Mailer is the other one I was thinking of. Yeah. So yeah, I tell people Austin is this great city with all this cool hip stuff to do. And after my time there, when people ask me what to do, I say, go to the Harry Ransom Center. Mm-hmm. you can drink a craft beer anywhere. You can.
Yeah, Mammoth has his collection there.
That's
too.
Right.
So many great collections.
He's another one. Yeah. So let's talk for a minute about you wrote 2 William Faulkner biographies. The Past is Never Dead was the first one, covering up to 1897 to 1934, and then the second one is An Alarming Paradox.
Yes, This Alarming Paradox.
Okay. So what is the how do you decide on where to split something like that?
Mm-hmm. It's a little arbitrary, to be honest.
Okay.
And some other biographer might have made a different choice. For me, it just seemed, just moving into the 1930s, after he's written some of his great works like The Sound and the Fury, and As I Lay Dying, Light in August, for example, Sanctuary, that he's beginning to, I use this phrase throughout the second volume of the Faulkner biography, to write a new kind of history. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is that he starts in 1934 to write a novel called Pylon, which is actually about aviators. It's not his usual subject, although he was very interested in aviation. But he's usually associated with Southern novels, with his mythical county, Yaknapatawpha. Mm-hmm. But the book after that, Absalom, it's where he really comes to grips with history in a conscious, deliberate way. It's the first novel to do that. It's not that there aren't elements of the same history in earlier books, but his treatment of race in Light in August, for example, is striking. But the issue of race, of how one is defined by race, doesn't come until the middle 1930s. So that seemed, going into Pylon and Absalom, to begin the second volume, seemed the right way to do it. And in terms of, it also depends on the kind of material you have. With a 2-volume biography, you're trying to even it out so that one volume is not too much longer than the other. So the second volume, I think, is about 100 pages longer than the first. But if you look at them side by side on the shelf, there isn't that much of a physical difference between the 2 volumes.
Sure. Yeah. No, that period is interesting to me. I know when we were digging into our research, and we had the great writer Aaron Gwynn on to help us out, who's a novelist and teaches at UNC Charlotte. He's a bit of a Faulkner scholar or aficionado himself. And I was really fascinated about this exact time period. Okay, so he writes Pylon, which if another writer put it out, it would probably be considered a great novel. But in Faulkner's oeuvre, it's a little bit of a clunker, I think. And then writes Absalom right after, which is on the same shelf as Moby Dick or any great novel.
Right.
And it's that transition is amazing to me.
Well, it's interesting because the reason he wrote Pylon in a way is that he was having trouble with Absalom. It was such an intricate novel. His solution
is to write another book.
Yes, to write another book. He did the same thing when he was working on a fable. He stops, he's having trouble, and he writes Intruder in the Dust.
Yeah.
Very typical of Faulkner to do that.
He was something else. That was another thing I kind of learned. And this is what's fascinating about doing the research into going deeper into the artist's life is you do start to get a sense of what they're like. And Faulkner, I think, he had a certain stamina and energy that we don't really see in many of our other subjects. I don't think. Like you say, okay, I'm having a little trouble writing this book, so I'll just write an entire other book. Right? Most people would go on vacation or whatever. They would find,
or they would just whine about the writer's block.
Yeah, or they would take 20 years to do it. Yeah, exactly. And he just sort of bared down and just did it. So that's pretty amazing. Absalom, I think I heard you in an interview or a presentation you were giving. You described that as his best or his greatest book. Is it the history, the what you're talking about in terms of his adoption of a new approach at history? What is it about Absalom that you think, amongst all of his great books, puts it at the top?
Yeah. It's hard. Some people might say The Sound and the Fury. Some people might pick another novel.
Yeah.
For me, it's Absalom because of the tremendous number of layers in the book. And it's both its mental reach, but its geographical reach. And it's, partly it's set in the 19th century, part of it's set in the 20th century. The range of characters, not only Quentin Compson, the Southerner who's at Harvard, he's in the Northeast, but his roommate, Shreve McCann, who's a Canadian who takes over some of the story. And for me, Shreve is absolutely crucial because it's, in a sense, it's Faulkner's way of saying, this might be about the South, but it's a story that needs these other narrators. And it's a story that can only be told over time. In other words, the story keeps changing as each narrator in different eras or epochs tries to put together this story of Thomas Sutton, who comes into Jefferson, Mississippi, has a plantation, and what he represents is something that keeps evolving and changing right to the end of the novel. And the novel's ending is just extraordinary when Shreve McCann, the Canadian, says to Quentin Compson, I who regard you now, he's talking about thousands of years from now, I who regard you now will have sprung from the loins of African kings. It's such an anthropological statement, in a time of Jim Crow, in a time of segregation. It's just amazing. And we haven't even gotten to me, maybe the greatest character ever in American literature, which is Charles Bond, who is of mixed race. And what's fascinating about Charles Bond is that to look at him, and this, of course, can be true with people who identify as Black, he doesn't look Black.
Right.
He's not, or to use the words of the time, he's not Negro.
Right.
And he behaves with such a sophistication and with such grace. He rarely speaks in the novel, but there's a letter that he writes. And it's one of the few occasions in Faulkner's work in which his character is able to write in a style and with a complexity that rivals Faulkner's.
Right.
And he gives this to a mixed race man. And what part of what makes the novel great, I think, and that people might miss if they don't have a sense of the history of American literature is into the 1930s, what do mixed race people represent? They represent a diluting of white blood.
Right.
They actually, they're not one or the other. They're confused people. They're people who don't really fit into the society. They're neither white nor Black. And that's supposed to make them psychologically disabled.
Right.
Well, the last thing in the world that Charles Bond is psychologically disabled.
Sure. Yeah.
The person who's psychologically disabled is the pure white Southerner, Quentin Compson.
Right.
So the irony of this is extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
I make one reference in the second volume to Barack Obama, because that's one of the things that made him both appealing, but also disturbed people.
Mm-hmm.
He's not really Black. Some
Right.
black people say.
Right.
He's
Mhm.
not really
Right.
black. Some white people say.
Mhm.
He's
Yeah.
Charles Bond. He,
I
you
never
know,
made that
and
connection, but
he's
yeah.
not even,
Mhm.
people say he's not even American, you know,
Yeah. Right.
Barack Obama. He came from Kenya,
Right.
you know, and why, you know, Hawaii is exotic enough, but no, we have to, you know, because his father's African.
Yeah.
And Charles Bond, same thing. He comes from New Orleans, a sophisticated cosmopolitan city. What's he doing in this backwater provincial place, Jefferson, Mississippi?
Right.
So, you know, for Faulkner to imagine a character like this, there's just no one like this in American literature.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's why. You know, I mean, there are a lot of other reasons. It's a novel about displacement. You know, the history of the 20th century and now the 21st century is refugees.
Yeah.
And Bond is a kind of refugee. But so is Faulkner in Hollywood.
Right.
He was a displaced
Yeah.
person. It's a novel about displacement. I mean, you just can't get a novel that's more relevant to world history, let alone American history.
Yeah. Yeah.
So as Billy Crystal says, don't get me started.
Yeah. No, that's what I wanted. I wanted to get you started. That was great. And I much of that resonates with my reading of it, and you're giving me even more to think about there for sure. I did want to think in terms of Absalom, you know, thinking about how that book is structured and how it sort of works as a novel. I can't help but think about how you might relate to it as a biographer, because it is in a way a biography of not only Charles Bond, but Thomas Sutpen, and about how biographies are constructed. And so, you know, is there an element of, okay, so we've got this telling the story of Thomas Sutpen, and it's getting refracted and watered down and recapitulated and all these things. When you think about a subject you're writing a biography about, say like William Faulkner, there were William Faulkner biographies before yours, and you know, I'm sure there were Marilyn Monroe biographies before yours.
Oh yeah.
What is it? How do you then take that and build on that and say, well, there's another layer, or there's another way to shine light on this subject. There's another way to look at this that's relevant and worth me spending all the time and energy to do it. Yeah.
Well, the funny thing is, you mentioned my Toronto PhD, and I did a PhD dissertation on Faulkner, which is called Uses of the Past in the Novels of William Faulkner.
Very cool.
It is available. As well.
All right. Well, yeah.
It's
very
in print.
Cool. You've got about 20. How many books in print? Dozens.
Oh, yeah. Close to 40. Actually.
Okay. Yes.
I didn't realize this in graduate school, because nobody, even now in graduate school, nobody thinks of, if you're in a department of English, no one really thinks of doing a biography, and you're discouraged from doing biographies for a whole variety of reasons. But I was interested in history and historiography. And historiography is simply a study of the way history is told. That's essentially what historiography is. And I looked at Faulkner's novels, particularly Absalom, and a later one, Go Down Moses. And I said, these are historiographical novels. They're not only about history, they're about the way history gets told and changed, which is what biographers are interested in. But I didn't realize that my real interest was not history per se, that my interest was biography, until I read Norman Mailer in his biography of Marilyn Monroe, because he talks about biography and what it means to be a biographer. And what he does in that book, which is what the characters do in Absalom essentially is you've got a story that you're interested in. There's something in that story that appeals to you, and you begin to, you find an interest in that individual, whoever that is, and you realize, if there are other biographies, or in Absalom, other stories about this person, there's something missing. Well, how do you know there's something missing? Well, there might be missing evidence, or there might be conflicting testimony, but there's also something missing because you think you know something about this character. There's something in this character you identify with. Yeah. So then you begin to say, well, maybe I should write a biography, because there are things and this is true with all my subjects, if there have been other biographies of them, there are things about my subjects that I say, I know something. I may be operating under an illusion that this is true, but it's an important illusion for me that it doesn't matter how many biographies there have been of Marilyn Monroe or William Faulkner. I know things because of my own experiences and certain things that my subject has gone through that I think tell a story that hasn't been told yet. I think people often say, well, why is there another biography of so-and-so? As if what biography is simply content.
Right.
You know, it's a story.
Right,
I know the story of William Faulkner. Why do I need to know this story again?
He's already got a Wikipedia page.
Yeah,
What else is there to say about him? Right. Yeah.
I used to have editors in New York say when my agent was pitching my biography of Lillian Hellman, and an editor actually said to me, well, Hellman's written her own story. And I thought, what? Well, yeah, she did. But that's an autobiography. There's a world of difference between an autobiography and a biography.
Oh, yeah. Enormous, right?
A sophisticated editor in New York can't see that?
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, an autobiography, I'm sure there's a lot to be gained from as a biographer, reading someone's autobiography.
Oh, sure.
It's probably a good reference. But I think about with Faulkner, I mean, Faulkner spent many years of, well, his whole story about going to the Royal Canadian Air Force, or that he was a fabulist about so many details about that.
Yes.
That, okay, if you were just going off of what Faulkner said about his life, how do you know what's real, what's not? There's BS. Well, there's you know.
There was this famous literary critic, Malcolm Colley, who put together this anthology, the Portable Faulkner. And he wanted to have a biographical section. And Faulkner had been telling, as you say, these fabulous tales about World War I. And Colley kept saying, well, you know, we need to put in some things about your war service. And by this time, Faulkner, you know, was an older man. He was in his 40s, and he was about a few years away from the Nobel Prize. And he kept saying to Colley, let's get
no big deal.
Oh, we don't need that so much anymore.
We don't need that. Just say I served. You know, I served. That's all people need to know.
May I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, of course, because this is the podcast about sort of the dark side of creativity, and dovetailing into what you were saying about your insights into Faulkner and all the rest of it. If you had to summarize, or I guess riff on, what at the heart of his personality and his own biography, his own past, was the thing, do you think, that drove that I guess wild creative energy to not just have one book going, but two, and great novels, and
that incredible run he had of As I Lay Dying and Sound and the Fury, you know, writing these things.
I think it's and it's partly why I identify with him. You know, no man in Faulkner's family lived past the age of 60. His grandfather and father both died at an early age, and his great grandfather was murdered.
Yeah,
on
the old
street.
colonel.
Yeah, the old colonel. I think part of it is Faulkner's sense of mortality. He said at one point when someone asked him about his style, he's trying to get the whole of existence into a single sentence. You know, and people ask, why are some of these sentences so long? Because life is in suspension, and the sentences are suspenseful in that way. Very different from the suspense of most detective novels, where you want to get on with the plot and so on. So people get very frustrated with Faulkner for that reason. But he's holding up all this at once, and he's a man in a hurry. I think he does have this sense of mortality, and I think there's an urge there that can't be entirely explained. What attracts me to him, and it attracts me to all of my subjects, is their incredible ambition. An ambition that can't be satisfied. Some people, if they could write the Sound of Fury, would say, well, that's enough.
Right.
You know,
right.
I can't do better than that. And the other thing about Faulkner is he wasn't afraid of failure. He wasn't afraid to fail. And he often said that in his interviews.
That's
So
kind
I
of
think,
where he got in trouble with Hemingway a little bit, right? Because
right,
when he said Hemingway wasn't brave, he was talking
yeah,
about this, I
as a
think.
writer, yeah,
Right,
yeah, he
right.
didn't take enough risks. He didn't
Hmm.
take enough chances. That's why Faulkner liked Thomas Wolfe, because he thought Wolfe was a great risk taker.
Yeah.
So I think it's that driving ambition, that sense of mortality, and also that indefinable literary sensibility that most people in his environment didn't understand and didn't appreciate.
Mm-hmm.
And because they didn't understand and appreciate, he had to show them.
Right,
He
right.
had to say, see, look at
Yeah.
this. The other thing is, he did have one person, and this is often true with great figures. He was a mama's boy. He
Yeah.
had a mother who thought he was just great.
Hmm.
And Faulkner's niece says in her memoir of Faulkner and the Faulkner family, the only person that ever heard him talk about his work was his mother.
Wow.
But how did he talk to his mother? They went off into a room and talked about what Faulkner was writing. He never shared that. Very rarely, even with his own wife.
Right.
Not with his daughter, not with his brothers, not with anybody else. This is going beyond what you asked me, but
No, that's all right.
Faulkner, what intrigues me about Faulkner is how much he won't tell us about himself. That's a real goad to a biographer.
Right.
How do you talk about a man who, unlike Sylvia Plath, is not writing down what happens every day?
Right, right.
You know, he writes letters, but compared to Hemingway, for example, Hemingway's letters would go on for volumes and volumes and volumes. You know,
right.
that Faulkner does not. He won't put any part of himself in a letter. It's very rare for him to do that because it all goes into the fiction. So I had to, at various points in the biography, almost like a Poe detective, find what was hiding in plain sight. That's what Monsieur Dupin does in Poe's short story.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
purloined letter.
Mhm.
It's there,
Right.
but it's really hard to see, even though it's there in front of us.
Yeah.
So he's just to me, the most intriguing subject I've ever had, because he says it once to his mother. He writes to her from New Orleans, and he says, I met Sherwood Anderson. We really got along together. Anderson was touting the first published novel that Faulkner was writing, Soldier's Pay. And he said, Anderson's writing this story. The story was called A Meeting South. And he said, I'm in it as a character. You know, I'm disguised. His name is David in the story. But I'm in it. And then he says to his mother, don't tell anybody. You know, it's like a trade secret.
Right.
Don't share this with anybody. That was in 1925.
That's before he'd had any real success.
Right.
Yeah.
And he stuck by that his entire life.
Wow.
He never parted the curtain.
Huh.
You never saw behind what was going on. The only way you can get at that is in a few letters and in his manuscripts, his revisions and things like that. And the other way you do it, and it goes back to Absalom. Absalom is that if you stick with the material long enough, you see patterns.
Sure.
And you see what's important to him. And sometimes it's one sentence. There's a section of my second volume where this is after he's won the Nobel Prize, and he goes to Hollywood as a favor to Howard Hawks. That's one reason, because he worked better with Hawks than anybody else in Hollywood, and Hawks protected him, took care of him. And also because the pay was really good.
Oh yeah, they were
even after winning the Nobel Prize, the money was important because he wanted to be like his great-grandfather. His great-grandfather was a public benefactor. So all that Nobel Prize money went into scholarships and other things. Faulkner did not hold on to that money. And the royalties were just really beginning to start in the 50s with his novels in terms of him leading a comfortable living. So he goes to Hollywood. And he says to his lover, I have to work on this film, The Left Hand of God. I don't really think it's going to make a very good movie. Then he writes to another woman he was involved with, Joan Williamson. He's staying in the Chateau Marmont. He says, Chateau Marmont, fantastic. And he says, fantastic work. Just the opposite of what he said at the beginning. So I began to think about that. What happened to this man? Because he's never going to tell me.
Right.
So I read the script that he wrote for The Left Hand of God. It was eventually made into a film with Humphrey Bogart, but not with Faulkner's script. But it's the story about a man who's a soldier of fortune working for a Chinese warlord. And he's on the run because he's done something the warlord doesn't like, sort of asserted his own authority. And he's on the run. And he adopts a disguise in this Chinese village. He becomes, that is, he wears the clothes of a Roman Catholic priest. And these people, he's good at it. He's a lapsed Catholic. He doesn't believe in God, but it's his life. He knows the traditions
and the.
He knows the traditions. He knows how to perform the service. He knows how to do confession. People bow down to him, and it turns out he's really good at being a priest. Really good, really good.
Yeah.
And he's absolutely. What happens in Faulkner's version of this movie is that he actually at one point submits to the authority of the Catholic Church, says, I've done wrong by impersonating this priest. And how he gets out of the business with the Chinese warlord is also quite interesting. That we don't really need to go into that. But I started to think about this. Why did Faulkner say it was fantastic work? He never said that about, only once before when he worked on a film called Sutter's Gold. But generally, he just as with his novels, he didn't talk about what he was writing. And all he says is fantastic work. Well, this occurs after the Nobel Prize. Well, what happened after the Nobel Prize? He became a world figure.
Yeah, he was going
His
everywhere.
Nobel Prize speeches like nobody else's. People came to him as a kind of sage, really as a kind of priest. And he was most reluctant. He thought of himself as impersonating this role, just like the guy in the film. And then I came across this letter to one of his friends, Phil Stone, from a young writer, who said, I can't tell you how much William Faulkner means to me as an example. Well, Stone showed that letter to Faulkner. This had to have had an impact on Faulkner.
Yeah.
And that's what that part of my book is about. I don't say maybe, perhaps, maybe he felt this way. He must have felt this way.
Right.
I don't know.
Right.
But I present, just as Faulkner does in Absalom, I present the pattern.
Right.
Look at this pattern. How could this pattern possibly be accidental?
Right. Yeah, no, and that seems like that's the kind of, where you're right, you're trying to get after this figure who is a public figure, but has maintained on purpose some degree of mystery. I remember reading about this post-Nobel phase and him being really reluctant to be, to have biographical stuff written about him, to be interviewed. And yet he would go to, I think he went to South America at one point on a story.
He went to South America. He went to Japan.
Yeah.
Yes.
So he was willing to participate in it to some degree, but he didn't want people on his turf, it seemed like.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When he first did this, when he first went on a trip for the State Department, and he was, there's no writer has ever done this. I mean, they've been on junkets for the State Department, for sure. But no one had this kind of world position, authority that Faulkner had. And when he realized that, just like the priests performing services and the people are so grateful in the film, when he realized that, and this is where one of his letters that actually does reveal something, he writes to the State Department, Howard Howland at the State Department, he says, I think I can do some good here. Well, that couldn't have occurred without the Nobel Prize. Right. You see what I mean?
Right.
He wouldn't have been in that position. He was never in that position before to realize the impact his words might have on other people. Right. It was a whole new thing. And that discovery, as I say, gets back into that movie script.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it. Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar somewhat with this Hollywood work, but I didn't know much of anything about that film. That's
Well,
absolutely
well,
fascinating.
that's the other thing. That's why I wrote this biography,
Mm-hmm.
because I've written about Hollywood figures, and I knew
Mm-hmm.
Hollywood, and I knew what Hollywood did to people, to actors, to writers, and so on. He acted as if he was impervious to Hollywood. Um, but especially the memoir of his lover, Meta Carpenter, showed that that wasn't true, that occasionally it did break through
Yeah,
to
yeah.
him, and that there is a synergy. There is a kind of intertextuality, the academics call it, between the movies and the film. It comes into my book, especially when I write about. He wrote the screenplay of Drums Along the Mohawk. Again, it was
Mm-hmm.
radically changed by the time it got to the screen. But if you look at his original screenplay and then you read his novel, The Wild Palms, there are actually a few lines in The Wild Palms that come right out of
Oh, really?
the script for Drums Along the Mohawk. And
Interesting.
there's a reference to Eisenstein. He worked on an Eisenstein
Yeah.
script when he was working on Sutter's Gold. And there's a
Mhm.
reference to Joan Crawford,
Oh,
who,
really?
yes, when he was working with Howard Hawks, they were going to do a film of his short story, and the studio said, "It's all men. We need a
Mhm.
role for Joan Crawford." And Hawks said to him, "Bill, I hate to break it to you," because Faulkner had already written the script, and Hawks liked it. The producer at MGM, Irving Thalberg, liked it. They were all set to go, and they were doing like 3 or 4 films a year with Joan Crawford, and there wasn't anything to do. And Thalberg suddenly said to Hawks, "I have to break it to you, but you're going to have to write a woman into this movie." So what happened then? This is, again, an instance where we don't really know. What we do know is Crawford was uneasy because she knew it was a man's picture. And she says, "You've got to make me talk like the men."
Mhm.
Now, the other thing I know about Hawks is he would sit down with Faulkner and say, "Now, I know you know, this was early in the early 30s. You don't know much about filmmaking, but here's the way the camera works." There's
Mhm.
Orson Welles once said, you can describe the basics in a day. That doesn't mean
Mhm.
you can do it, but I mean, you can
Right.
describe the basics to a writer in a day, what you expect him to do in a treatment or a screenplay.
Mhm.
And Hawks did that. But what people don't talk about is I think Joan Crawford did that too.
Oh, really?
I know that they
Yeah.
had a meeting, and I know
Yeah.
she would have sat down and she would have said, "Now, what's in it goes into a Joan Crawford film, etc." She had to have done that because it was in her own interest to do that.
Right. And she was
Sure.
that kind of self-possessed
And
sort
she
of,
was that kind of
yeah.
self-possessed person.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he learned all that. Try and find anywhere in the archive,
Right.
what he might have learned from Joan Crawford. And again, literary scholars, what are they interested in? They're interested in Sound of Fury. And if Faulkner says,
Right.
"Oh, those films weren't important," they just take him at his word.
Right. Right.
Uh,
Right.
Whereas my feeling is this guy was a great writer. If he was a
Yeah.
great writer, nothing was lost on him.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. Why do you think he would dismiss the Hollywood experience? Is it because he doesn't think it has the sort of artistic merit that the literature does, or
That's
because he
part of
didn't?
it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
he's
was
part of
thinking
the
too because it wasn't that successful in Hollywood in terms of he didn't have any screenplays that or films that he worked on that rival the great classics of that time. Really, I don't even know what stands out that he still has a screen credit for, To Have and To Have Not,
yes, To Have and Have Not, in The Big Sleep.
in The Big
And I
Sleep.
think in
Yeah.
both cases, he was instrumental. I
Hmm.
think he didn't want to take more credit because he was a hired hand.
Hmm.
It was work for hire.
Hmm.
He was usually working in collaboration.
Right.
On The Big Sleep, it was him and Lee Brackett, who was a
Okay.
woman.
Hmm.
He worked very well with her. He had a sense of structure. She talked about this, how he sat down. He said, "No, I can do this. You can do that," and that worked. And To Have and Have Not, his creation of the Walter Brennan character in that film, it's him, Eddie. Eddie only has a couple lines in the novel, To Have and Have Not, and Jules Furthman wrote the original script, and the Eddie character was quite different. So what we have, and it's really important, as I point out both in my Walter Brennan biography and the Faulkner biography, it really made the difference into what that film is. It's one of the great anti-fascist films. And Faulkner understood that because he had, in 1925, had been in Mussolini's Italy. And he understood the way fascism worked. And of course, he would have understood it by simply living in the South, which in many ways was a fascist land. He said of Light in August, when he created the character Percy Grimm, I created the first Nazi. This was started writing it in 1931, before Hitler came to power. So he knew those things. He was more political than people gave him credit for. But as far as films go, I think it's because, as I say, he was part of a team. And unlike, say, Scott Fitzgerald and a lot of other very good writers, he didn't resent that. He was there to pick up a paycheck. He was like a carpenter. He was there to do really good work. He could do piecework. He could write a scene in a film like Air Force when nobody else could do it. And Hawke said, "Bill, I think you can do it," and he did. It's a wonderful scene in Air Force. He could do that he could work off the books for Jean Renoir in a film called The Southerner. He could do very well, especially in terms of his sense of structure. He had problems with film dialogue. There's no doubt about it, and that's what people often mention. But he had a cinematic imagination in terms of what he could visualize and the way he could structure that vision. And you could see that even before he goes to Hollywood in a novel like Sanctuary. Very, very cinematic novel. So I think there was that. I think he felt his reputation, rested on him being a novelist. And of course, there's still a debate to this day whether you would consider screenplays literature or not. And so it just wasn't, he worked on over 50 projects. And so a lot of this was incomplete work. They weren't all produced.
Right.
He was upset about Hollywood. He actually had some sentences about Hollywood in his Nobel Prize speech, which he then took out. So that's how I know Hollywood was on his mind.
Yeah.
Even when he's writing Nobel Prize speech, when you look at the total number of days, he spent something like 4 to 5 years in Hollywood. That's
a long time. Yeah, it really is.
And Hollywood has a way in the American psyche. If I'm taking anything from this interview, and I'm very grateful for this, learning a lot, and I'm really enjoying it. Brad, I'm enjoying your questions as well. It's just this gap between the sense of Faulkner as an author of the Old South and then this Hollywood Faulkner are so at odds, I think, in the image we have of him. So it's really a pleasure to kind of have that bridge crossed a little bit here as we listen to you. But it also seems to me, again, based on this interview, he is an author worth reading now and continuing to go back to, at the risk of making a cliche there. I mean, I don't think. I mean, I think I know you're going to agree, but I just think it's worth stating that this interview has me feeling that way. I think that's true, and I think his later work, especially the last 2 volumes of the Snopes trilogy, much underrated. People really, at the time when those books came out in the 50s, they really didn't understand what he was about, I think. And I think people are ready to read those books now. And I think we'd have a very different view of many literary critics were stuck in the 30s and 40s, and he had moved on. And one of the reasons he had moved on, to go back to Hollywood, is what he was writing in Hollywood. He was writing war movies. He wrote a film called Battle Cry, which, if it had ever been produced, would have cost $4 million and would have covered every battle theater in the world, from China to occupied Paris to the whole thing. So he was moving in another direction. He had this sense of the world building up in him.
And he'd traveled now, and he'd met all kinds of people. He'd been in every circle of society you can imagine. It's very, and going from writing As I Lay Dying supposedly on the back of a wheelbarrow to winning the Nobel and touring the world, and he's definitely became a kind of cosmopolitan person, despite maintain. I can never pronounce the county's name. What it
Yaknapatawpha, yeah.
See, you
Yeah.
could tell that you're a Faulkner
Yaknapatawpha.
scholar because that just rolls right off your tongue. The rest of us struggle with it.
Gwen was the ringer on the core episode.
Yeah.
Aaron Gwynn came in and just said it right away, and
Yeah,
Brad and I were like, okay, great. I do have another question as
Sure.
we kind of wind down the core episode here and look forward to the Patreon episode, the After Dark, where we're going to talk about Faulkner's favorite television show, which that's going to be a lot of fun. The question I have pertains to booze and alcohol, and I would ask,
Oh, sure.
I would ask what role do you think in 5 minutes? What role do
Sure.
you think alcohol played in his life, and did he ever try to kick it? Did he ever try to quit?
Yeah, that's interesting. He never tried to quit. He said, one of his jokes was, there's an awful lot of nourishment in an acre of corn. He loved white lightning. He loved, he loved his bourbon. He loved really, and he was, by the way, he was a connoisseur of fine wine. The guy knew his wines.
Okay.
And unlike, you could call him an alcoholic, but unlike a lot of alcohol, his wife was an alcoholic. She eventually kicked it. Yeah. She went to Alcoholics Anonymous in the last few years of their marriage. She was completely sober. But she was the kind of alcoholic where she had a drink or two and she went silly. She went crazy. He could be a social drinker. He could go for long, long periods of drinking wine, for example, and in company. Or he could stay with his New York publisher who had a bar, right in the house. And the publisher said he never went to the bar. He never took a drink. And I don't think he drank, or very little, while he was writing. People think, that poses because he was drunk. And no, you don't write that kind of stuff when you're drunk.
That was the thing is, too, I don't buy that. I mean, I believe being a heavy drinker, but the actual writing itself.
Yeah,
I write
joke about it.
Yeah, I write fiction, and you can't do that.
One of the relatives in the family had trouble reading him, and she said, "Bill, were you drunk when you wrote this?"
Yeah,
and he said, "Well, not all the time."
Right.
But he was unapologetic about it. He was apologetic in the sense that if he made a fool of himself,
which he did from time to time.
Yeah. He would apologize because that was bad manners. But the idea of going to Alcoholics, one of his screenwriter buddies, Buzz Bezarides, and Meta Carpenter, his lover, tried to drag him off to not an AA meeting, but some kind of drying out spot in Hollywood. And on the way there, he said, "Well, are they going to give me a drink?" He just, he was incorrigible. I mean, there was no guilt about it at all. There was none of that. Lauren Bacall, when he was in Europe, again, working for Howard Hawks in a film called Land of the Pharaohs. But before they got over to Egypt, they were in Europe, in St. Moritz. And Lauren Bacall and Humphrey Bogart was there. And of course, he knew them quite well from To Have and Have Not. And she said, at one point to him, she said, "Bill, why do you drink?" And he said, "Well, if I have a drink, I feel good. If I have a second drink, I feel better. And if I have a third drink, there's no stopping me."
Oh, jeez. Yeah, that's a dangerous attitude to have.
I don't think that we're going to top that for the main episode here. Brad, do you want to bring us on home, and we'll take a quick break and then do the Patreon?
Yeah, so that's it for the main episode. Thank you so much, Carl. Much appreciated. We'll have links to all of your stuff in all of the places where the episode is posted, and we'll be active on Twitter about it. You can follow us, folks, on Twitter at Art of Dark Pod, or go to the website, artofdarkpod.com. All kinds of links there to support us on Patreon, etc. And Carl, where can people find you, find your work, and that sort of thing?
Well, I have a weekly book review column at the New York Sun. So if they just do newyorksun.com, they're going to find me there. They're going to find me on Facebook. They're going to find me on Twitter. They're going to find me in all those places. My website, carlrollyson.com. So I'm not hard to find.
No, you're not. You are the hardest working man in biography, I think. So, yeah, again, much appreciated. Folks, give Carl a follow. Do a deep dive, see what he's up to, and show him some love.
Really a pleasure. I learned a lot, and I think we're going to call this episode "A Man in a Hurry."
Man in a hurry.
Man in a hurry.
I like that.